Hey, Armand here with an exposition on Mercury retrograde. Some general considerations for Mercury retrograde, the Cosmic Gremlin, I like to call Mercury retrograde. This is actually the second video I've done on Mercury retrograde. Well, that's appropriate, isn't it? The first one was about 10 years ago. It was a little short. YouTube doesn't like that. And so I'm redoing it. Anyway, it's very appropriate to redo videos or anything with Mercury retrograde. That's kind of what retrograde is all about. Now, Mercury, the planet of communication and things like that, we'll get into that, goes retrograde. That is, appears to move backwards in the sky. We know that Mercury doesn't really move backwards in the sky. The planet itself only appears to from our perspective because of its effect as we go around the sun and Mercury goes around the sun. 3 times a year for about 3 weeks each time, Mercury appears to go backwards in the sky. Mercury retrograde, which has really found its way into popular culture. People talk about Mercury retrograde. This is one of the astrological things you hear people talking about in the stores or something that, oh, must be Mercury retrograde. Mercury retrograde is famous for screwing up things, but it's famous for screwing up mercurial things. And there's your first takeaway from this video. Only mercurial things are affected by Mercury retrograde. Okay, so things having to do with communication, commerce, and as an extension of commerce, transportation, things that have to do with electronics, paperwork stuff, contracts, and things like that tend to be affected by Mercury retrograde. Those sorts of things. Test results, and I found medical test results tend to be a little sticky with Mercury retrograde. We'll get into that in a little bit. But things that are ruled by Mercury are affected, right? So Mercury retrograde is only going to affect mercurial things. It's not going to screw up your love life. You're going to do that by yourself if that happens. It's not going to screw up your career. You know, there could be setbacks and there could be miscommunications in your love life or career, but it's not going to affect that directly, only indirectly through communication, transportation, and stuff like that. You know, the text message that doesn't go through, or the text message that goes through to the wrong person, and stuff like that can happen. Now, one important thing to consider, even with mercurial things, is that they tend to be set back and they tend to be delayed when Mercury is retrograde. Very rarely are they completely disrupted. In other words, you have to, slog through that bit of paperwork for a long time to get the result that you're looking for. But it doesn't mean that you're not ever going to get that result, that it's a complete disaster. And if it is something that is permanent in nature, it's usually fairly inconsequential. That's another important thing to keep in mind. If there's anything permanent, it's usually fairly inconsequential. For example, one of the things that we would always say is not to buy a car with Mercury retrograde. I bought a car with Mercury retrograde. I really had no choice. Circumstances kind of pushed me into it. I bought the car with Mercury retrograde. Fine car. It is still running today. No problems. Everything is good. The only thing, and it is a permanent thing, the only thing is that it was a model year earlier than I thought it was. No wonder I got such a great deal. But you know what? That was the only thing that was wrong with it. That was the only thing that went wrong. That was like a permanent issue. So only mercurial things are affected, and even they tend to be delayed rather than completely destroyed. And the consequences tend to be less than dramatic when they are the result of Mercury retrograde. Now let's talk a little bit about the timing of Mercury retrograde. For this, I will once again bring out high-tech materials, and I'm going to just simply describe to you what happens here. And that is, we have the planet Mercury, and he's coming forward in the sky, and he gets to a certain point, and then he stops. And that is called the station retrograde. And then he retrogrades for 3 weeks, goes backwards in the sky against the backdrop of stars, and then he stations again. We'll call that the station direct. And then he comes forward again. And that is the pattern for Mercury retrograde. Here's the way I like to describe it. Supposing you're walking on 9th Avenue up from 20th Street to 60th Street, about a 3-mile walk. You're walking up 20th Street, you pass 30th Street, 35th Street, you get to 40th Street, you remember, I got to go back to 30th Street and do something. So you walk back from 40th to 30th, and you do whatever has to be done. Maybe you stop into a little bar and pay your bar bill. And then that's a good thing to do with Mercury retrograde, by the way. It involves clearing up commerce issues. And then you walk back again from 30th Street up to 60th Street, passing 40th Street on the way. Now that means that you have covered the distance between 30th Street and 40th Street 3 times. Once going forward, once going backwards, and then once more going forward again. And that space between 30th Street and 40th Street is called the shadow of Mercury's retrograde. So here, we would say, a little bit like a finger or something, right? Here's, when Mercury gets to this point going forward, we say that he has entered into the shadow of his retrograde. And then when he gets past this point going forward again, we say he has cleared the shadow of his retrograde. And so this area here, this entire area here, whether he's going forward or backwards, is the shadow. Well, if he's going backwards, it's just Mercury retrograde. But the 2 times that he's going forward, initially and then after the retrograde, it's called the shadow period. And the shadow period is important because it sort of extends the retrograde a little bit. Things that happen in the forward moving shadow, often don't work out all that well, even though Mercury is technically direct. And what would happen, let's say right over here where this little point is, you do something here. You sign a contract, buy a computer program or something like that. And then during the retrograde, when Mercury gets back to that point, you've got to redo it. You got to bring it into the repair shop. You've got to send out to, oh, we have to redo that contract, whatever it is. And then when you get past that point again, going forward, is when the matter gets resolved. That's a good story for things that happen during the shadow of the retrograde. One more little timing consideration is that things that happen during the retrograde, if they screw up, sometimes during the shadow, but often during the retrograde, if they screw up, then you sometimes have to wait till the next or a subsequent Mercury retrograde. So things that happen on a Mercury retrograde that don't get resolved by the time he's out of the shadow going forward, well, those things can actually have to wait until the next retrograde or even a retrograde after that. That's mostly the case when things happen here during the retrograde, although even then you can hope that they'll be resolved as he, someplace in the shadow or after he leaves the shadow of the retrograde. But sometimes you have to go back and deal with things later. It could be true of things that happen on the forward shadow. The things that you initiate on the outbound shadow, if you buy something here, usually that's not a problem. Usually once Mercury has gone direct, you're okay. Now, well, yes, but you want Mercury to be moving up to speed, because when Mercury is at those station points, the station to retrograde or the station to go direct, that's when you have the most problems. That's when the really prominent stuff happens during the station time. That is, let's say, 2 days before a station and 2 days afterwards. Let's say that. That's where you're going to get the most prominent effects. Right in here, right before it stations, right at the station, and backwards, and then right before the station direct, and then right after the station direct. Oh, Mercury went direct today. You're going to give it some time. You're going to give it 2 or 3 days. Okay, so that's an important consideration for timing. You want to make sure that you're clear of the stations. Even if you have to do something during the retrograde, okay. But if you do it right on the station, not so good. Not so good. Things tend to be more prominently problematic during the station of the retrograde. We'll talk a little bit more about problems, but let me give you a list of things that, classically you should not do, the don'ts and then the do's of Mercury retrograde. The first don't. It's not a good time to sign a contract. It's not a good time to sign a contract or deal with any sort of official paperwork. Now, you never know. Sometimes you have to deal with something during a Mercury retrograde or coming into the shadow or in the shadow before the retrograde. Sometimes you have to. If you have to, you have to. But be aware that those are the things that tend to be the most problematic, and they tend to require revisions later on, either during the retrograde or after the retrograde, or maybe on the next retrograde. So all kinds of contracts, official paperwork, this is not a good, don't get your passport application to send in. Try to do it clear of the shadow of the retrograde. You have to do your taxes or something like that. Try to do it clear of the shadow of the retrograde. You want to avoid especially serious government-y paperwork kind of things. Driver's license. You got to be careful with stuff like that. Credit cards. You got to be careful with things like that when you're around the retrograde. That's the first thing. So contracts and all kinds of paperwork stuff. If you have to do it, you have to do it. But if it's a voluntary kind of thing, try to defer it. Okay, so that's one thing. Buying electronics. That's another thing that you really don't want to do during a Mercury retrograde. A lot of times you'll find that the electronics have problems with them, but more than that, I would say much more than that, what you're likely to run into with Mercury retrograde is that something better will come out a little while later. So there you are. Something better will come out a little while later. And I'll tell you something about electronics. This is sort of a little off to the side, but Apple has released just about all of its most successful products very near a Mercury station, direct or retrograde, or during a Mercury retrograde. It has not impeded them one little bit. In fact, the products that they've launched with all kinds of, anticipation and hoopla, as they always do, that have not been near a Mercury retrograde have been markedly less successful. So the product has worked out well for them. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I've looked at the chart for Apple, and I think I've looked at the chart for Steve Jobs, but it's not a problem for them. And that's one of the things about Mercury retrograde. You know what? Even the problems are not consistent. You cannot consistently rely upon a problem showing up. So sometimes, you will sign a contract with Mercury retrograde and you'll be biting your fingernails and everything will be fine. How's that for you? Or you'll buy an electronic device and maybe it will work fine and there won't be a better option that comes up. Maybe you won't buy the product because you're thinking, well, it's Mercury retrograde, I shouldn't do it. And then it turns out that that product is no longer available when Mercury goes direct, and Mercury got you that way. It's all very unpredictable. We can say these are the do's and the don'ts, but the planets are tricksters, and they're at least much more clever than we are. So you're never quite sure what you're doing or not doing that is saving you from Mercury retrograde or not. That's why I always say, if you've got to do something, do it. So contracts and paperwork, best deferred around Mercury retrograde, best not to buy electronics, best not to buy a car or any means of transportation. Probably not the best time to buy a ticket, to go abroad or to, even on a local trip or something like that. But that's a separate matter. As long as you make sure you get to the right destination, that you're going to that you're going to London, England, and not London, Ontario. You're straight with that, so it should be okay. Not a good time to buy a new book. Not a good time to buy a new book. And I'll tell you something. When it comes to this sort of thing, I have had so many experiences because, I read a lot and get the books and all that sort of stuff. So I get a lot of books. And I have had the experience of being sure, like this book, I know I'm going to use. I know Mercury is about to go retrograde, but I'm so excited for it. This book I'm going to read. It's going to be great. It does not work out. It does not work out. It's hysterical. I was excited about a project for getting books about New York State and the history of spiritual movements in New York State over the. It was very interesting. It's very interesting stuff. You'd be surprised how many established and quirky spiritual movements got started here, including, of course, the whole spiritualist movement, the Fox sisters back in the 1840s. I was so interested. I'm still interested. You can see that. I bought the books. I'm still slogging my way through them, and I was so excited. And there's a little bit of a Mercury retrograde lesson. When Mercury is retrograde, or in fact, when any planet is retrograde, we have rather a compulsion to do the thing that we really shouldn't do with the planet retrograde. So, buying software or buying a new computer or getting a new phone, or buying that really good book. They're so appealing. They're so appealing with Mercury retrograde. You so want to do it. When a planet is retrograde, its power is strong. It's just not expressing itself very well. So we want to do what is indicated by the retrograde. And that's what we shouldn't be doing. Okay, so we have our list of don'ts. Don't with mercurial things. Cars, electronics, computer stuff, whether it's the hardware or the software, contracts and all kinds of paperwork and things like that. We want to try to put that mercurial stuff on the back burner. Now, in our society, we're not living in an agrarian culture anymore, right? We're not living in a culture where it is easy to put things on the back burner, right? I'm going to continue to put out my forecasts. I'm going to continue to, I might use the computer all day, every day. So I'm going to continue to do that in a sort of situation where we're not going to do things. And that's why Mercury retrograde hits us a little bit more. We just have to find ways to deal with it and work with it. So what are some of the do's with Mercury retrograde? Here we go. Well, one thing that you can do is to do things that are not mercurial. For example, it would be a great time to do some painting, to do some drawing, to make some music, or listen to music, or, go for walks. It's a great time to meditate. It's a great time to do things that are not so communication oriented. That's one thing. Another do. Try to have communication in person, facial expression, or at least on the phone where your voice has some quality. As soon as you start with the texting or the emails, it's too easy to go off. It's too easy to go off track. It's too easy for people to read things incorrectly, right? So when you have something to say, you're going to be communicating for those 3 weeks. When you have something to say it in person, make it as personal as possible so that your intent will get across, right? We want to get across the entire meaning of what you're saying, not just the denotative meaning, but the connotative meaning, what's implied by what you're saying. That's going to work much better if the quality of your voice and hopefully even your facial expressions can be seen. Zoom and other types of operations are a little bit weary with people after the pandemic, but still in all, you can get across more this way than you can just by typing things out. So that's an important do for Mercury retrograde. Another important do for Mercury retrograde, it is okay to get things repaired. If you need to repair something, you don't have to wait until after the retrograde. So if something goes on the fritz due to Mercury retrograde, you can get it repaired. Lots of words: redo, repair, reconsider. But the reconsidering is why you wind up getting the contracts redone. Okay, that's a good thing. Reread a book. reread a book. You probably didn't understand it the first time, or maybe you enjoyed it the first time. It's a good idea to reread something, see if you can pull more out of it, more information, more enjoyment. Reread things. Every Mercury retrograde, before the retrograde, I start thinking, I don't intentionally do it, but it always happens. I start thinking of books that I would like to reread or just generally revisit. I'm going to, during Mercury retrograde, I sort of get my little list together of the books and the articles and things that I want to reread during Mercury retrograde. And I don't do it. I don't do it. But but that's an appropriate thing to do. I could do it. I sometimes do it. I don't make my way through the list, but I do reread things and stuff. So that's a good strategy with Mercury retrograde. Okay, so we're going to redo things. We're going to revisit. We're going to reread. It's a very good time for research. It's not really a re-word. Well, maybe it is a re-word. It's a good time for research. If you can go and dig into things without necessarily looking to turn it into a product right away, if you're going to go and if you are going to reread things, or if you're going to read things maybe for the first time, but with the idea that you want to find something out, you'll get a great help out of Mercury retrograde. You're going in and you're digging things out, researching. Okay, that's one thing that you can do with Mercury retrograde. Again, though, it should be something that is already underway. It's not a great time to begin a research project. It's a good time to continue on with a research project. It should help research. It won't necessarily get it started. My books about upstate New York are a pretty good example of that. Do check and double check everything. From the time that Mercury gets into the shadow, let's say 2 weeks before the retrograde until he's out of the shadow, say 2 weeks after the retrograde, check and recheck everything. Are you sending this text to the right person? Are you sending the email to the right person? Did you include the documents that you're referencing that you say that are attached? It's one of my personal little things. One of the things that I tend to not do when Mercury retrograde, and sometimes just not do it. So you want to double check all your work. If you have to do anything, and you're going to have to do things with Mercury retrograde, you're going to double check and you're going to be as assiduous as possible. Who knows about things going wrong? Okay, a couple of Mercury retrograde stories that will help to sort of frame things. I used to say that things did not go wrong more often with Mercury retrograde, but rather that the problems were more prominent. I believe that that is not true. I believe that things go wrong more frequently and that some things are more prominent with Mercury retrograde. So, for example, people's luggage gets lost all the time. People's luggage gets lost all the time, like with air travel and things like that. I mean, there's a whole little division in the airport that handles lost luggage. And yet with Mercury retrograde, one airline, their whole baggage system just collapsed, and all they could do was make these big pyramids at John F. Kennedy Airport, and they were just like, well, if you can find your bags, you can find your bags. We can't do anything about it. And that was just it. You had to go search through the pyramids. There's traffic in the New York City every day. In the New York City area, we have traffic every day. That's not blamed on Mercury retrograde. But on a Mercury station, the Belt Parkway drawbridge, I can't believe there's still a drawbridge on the Belt Parkway, but it got stuck in the up position during Mercury. Hey, this is a very busy parkway. This is a very busy parkway. Got stuck in the upward position. That's a Mercury retrograde thing. I had a baggage situation, but actually I traveled in 2013. I traveled on a joint Mercury-Neptune station. It was a real Mercury-Neptune occasion, and it makes a good story, but we won't go into it here. But my baggage from a canceled flight got lost in that very airport, and I spent about 4 hours waiting for it, and they said that they would find it and send it on to me. And at this point in time, it's been 9 years and 10 months, and I'm still quite hopeful, but my hope is fading. A really nice shirt in there. Anyway, so we have things like that. My favorite Mercury retrograde story is I received on the last day of Mercury retrograde. I was living in Queens, New York on 201st Street, and I received a letter in the mail, in the old-fashioned postal mail. I received a letter that was addressed not to my house, but to some other house on 201st Street. Now, the thing about it was, it arrived, it had the wrong address. It wasn't my address, it was the wrong address, but it arrived at my house on the last day of Mercury retrograde. It had been mailed on the first day of Mercury retrograde. It was addressed to 201st Street, which is good. However, I was living in Queens, New York. The letter was mailed from and addressed to Topeka, Kansas. Apparently, there is a 201st Street in Topeka, Kansas. I looked it up. Somehow or another, that letter mailed on the first day of Mercury retrograde wound up about 1,500 miles and 7 houses off from its target. There's a good Mercury retrograde story for you. That's the kind of thing that happens. That's a mercurial mishap, if ever there was one. So stuff like this happens that is more prominent, and then little things go wrong. Generally speaking, the things that go wrong will get resolved at some point in time. I've seen it happen many, many times. I have to say that some things, like my lost luggage, don't wind up resolving themselves. But then again, it isn't the most major thing in the world, is it? And what's in your suitcase, I suppose. But in my case, it was just that nice shirt. Some things will be kind of persistent, though. And one special area, and I'm not giving you any medical advice. The last thing I would want to do is give you medical advice. But, Mercury, it is actually, the very symbol of medicine in the West is the caduceus of Hermes, and Hermes is Mercury. And one thing I have noticed is that medical tests that are done right on the station retrograde or station direct, particularly station retrograde, tend to be dicey in terms of the information. I've seen pregnancy tests that turned out not to have pregnancies. I've seen much more dire diagnoses come out that turned out to be incorrect. So you want to avoid the stations if you can, not to delay or postpone medical care on the basis of this. But if you have a choice, try not to get medical tests during the station, and perhaps maybe try to avoid Mercury retrograde if it isn't anything too important. If it was your annual checkup, maybe you can defer it afterwards or something. Or get it done beforehand. Something along those lines. Sometimes a lot of these things are out of our control. So we just have to go with it. If you get good or more likely bad news from a test, I would suggest that you maybe see about getting a second opinion or having the test redone. Again, if it is a possibility for you, if it doesn't offend the medical powers that be. That's an important consideration for Mercury retrograde. So we're not going to worry a lot about Mercury retrograde because usually things don't go too far wrong. The things that do go wrong, it's a pain in the neck to get them straightened out, but generally speaking, we'll get them straightened out. It only affects mercurial things. It doesn't affect Venusian things and martial things. It doesn't affect your career in the big sense and so on. If you send your resume to the wrong location or something like that, it'll have an effect, but that's, you'll probably be able to fix that at some point in time. So don't worry about Mercury retrograde, pay attention to it, and, do things that are not so mercurial for 3 weeks. You can do it.